Welcome to The Breach Show, featuring sharp analysis on politics and social movements in Canada. I'm your host, Desmond Cole. Today on the show, we're discussing bubble zones, laws limiting public demonstrations that have been expanding across Canada. Bubble zone laws limit the public areas where people can hold a protest, and in some cases, what they can say during a protest. They have been used in the past to restrict demonstrations outside of abortion clinics and public libraries. They've been used to limit demonstrations outside of hospitals during the height of COVID-19 and to restrict Indigenous solidarity actions in support of land claims. But the biggest recent target of bubble zone law have been Palestine solidarity demonstrations. To discuss this today, we have two guests. In a moment, you'll hear from Dalia Awwad, a local Palestinian organizer and a member of the Legal Support Committee, which has been supporting over 100 people charged at Palestine solidarity demonstrations in Toronto. Stay tuned for that conversation. But first, I spoke with Christine Van Geyn, a lawyer with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Her organization is currently challenging a bubble zone in place in Calgary, Alberta, after demonstrations there against trans-inclusive washrooms and drag queen story hour prompted the local government to act. Here's our conversation. Hi, Christine. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So to start off with, tell us about the Canadian Constitution Foundation, what it is and what its mission is.
So the Canadian Constitution Foundation is a legal charity in Canada. We do constitutional litigation that defends the fundamental freedoms of Canadians in the courts of law, but we also do public advocacy work in public opinions. And basically, we sue the government for unconstitutional laws that violate Canadians' freedoms, whether it's freedom of religion, freedom of expression, their equality rights, their rights to life, liberty, and security, kind of the whole spectrum of our fundamentally constitutionally protected rights.
Yeah, and I want to talk about a lawsuit that you're currently involved in at CCF, but more broadly, when did your group become interested in this idea of bubble zones and the legislation across Canada around them?
There have been provincial bubble zones in Canada for quite some time, but it's a newer phenomenon that bubble zone laws, these are these laws that prohibit protests within a specified geographic area around certain types of institutions. That as a municipal bylaw is relatively new. And the first one that we saw was passed in Calgary in March of 2023. So as soon as Calgary created this bylaw, we announced that we were going to sue the city over that bylaw, and that's what we did. The hearing occurred this February in 2025.
Let's talk about that Calgary bylaw, and let's just start with the premise for the law and like what brought it about as the CCF understands it.
Sure. So the impetus for this bylaw was protests over sort of two issues in Calgary that were what I would call cultural flashpoint. And these were a program that was being run at the city libraries called Reading with Royalty, where drag queens would read stories to children. And some members of the community objected to these programs, and they wanted to have protests saying, drag is not for children. And so they would protest these events. At the same time, there was also a policy in Calgary recreation centers that individuals who are transgender could use the bathroom that aligned with their gender identity on the basis of self-identification. And some members of the community also objected to this policy, so they protested at rec centers or community centers, particularly those with pools. And then there were counter protesters who wanted to advocate for the policy allowing for gender self-ID. So there were competing protests at these facilities. In response to these protests, the city of Calgary passed a bylaw called the Safe and Inclusive Bylaw that said people could not engage in what the city defined as a specified protest. We can talk about more about what specified protest means. It actually doesn't require there to be a protest at all. The definition has a major flaw there. but the main issue is that the city is targeting protests on the basis of the content or the subject matter of the protest. So a specified protest is defined as an expression of objection or disapproval on the basis of an idea or action related to, and then they list the protected human rights grounds, race, religion, color, gender identity, gender expression. And the list goes on. It includes things actually like place of origin, ancestry, marital status. So even though the intention of the bylaw was targeted at these protests over drag story hour and gender self-ID, it actually would capture a lot more. So for example, it could capture protests over war in foreign countries because it relates to place of origin. So it theoretically could capture the conflict in Russia or Ukraine. It could capture the war in Gaza. And the problem with targeting on the basis of the content of the speech is that the right to freedom of expression is a content neutral right. It's not for the government to come in and say these protests about, for example, climate change are permitted, but a protest over a war, over drug use, a drug addiction, over trans rights or women's rights, these are not permitted. Because once the government gets into deciding what topics we can protest and what topics we cannot, that right ceases to have meaning at all.
On the other side of this, of course, we have parents who are concerned about their children being able to access city services safely. We have people doing drag time story hour who just want to be able to provide an experience, who don't want to be attacked, who don't want to be harassed. So how do you address their concerns that this bylaw is meant to facilitate their safety and now you're challenging it?
Yeah, so this is the same argument anyone would make about any type of protest. And the thing is, in a society like ours, you will encounter people who disagree with you. You will encounter people who do not like what you are doing. You do not have a right not to be offended. The Supreme Court has held this repeatedly. It's articulated really well in a Supreme Court case called Ward. And the criminal law and bylaw already exists to deal with protests that may develop into a riot. It already allows for the removal of protesters who are blockading. So if this was an actual blockade where you cannot enter the building, bylaw, the Highway Traffic Act, and the Criminal Code already exist to deal with this. If your concern is being exposed to people who disagree with you, there's no right not to be exposed to that. And in fact, you should be exposed to people who disagree with you. It helps build resilience as a society to be exposed to people and ideas that are in competition with one another. And in fact, there's a lot of research that says that it's actually more affirming of the dignity of minority communities to have the rest of society speak up affirmatively and positively to defend marginalized or minority communities than censoring the people who are critics of them. When you push criticism underground, it actually allows it to fester and grow and can become more toxic and vile than allowing it to be criticized in public.
We saw something really interesting in Toronto last week where the city council in Toronto passed a bylaw around bubble zones. Their primary concern was pro-Palestine demonstrations, of which have come near synagogues and other Jewish institutions. They say it's not safe. They created a 50-meter bubble zone. The 100-meter proposal was defeated, but they put it to 50. And one of the interesting features in Toronto, Christine, is that this is kind of like a bubble zone by request proposal where you apply essentially to the city as a school, religious institution, or a childcare center. and you say, I think that I would benefit as an institution from these bubble zones. We don't want demonstrations happening outside of our building. And the city grants you this application. And they've made the process of applying itself quite lax. Like there isn't a whole lot that you have to demonstrate as an institution in order to qualify for one of these zones, which lasts for the period of a year, by the way, up from 180 days, which they proposed. What do you think about this idea of allowing people to opt in to a bubble zone? Because I think that the proposal and the idea is that, well, we're actually being very conscious of people's rights. So we're not going to do this over the entire city. We're going to let people who really need this protection apply for it.
Yeah, so we kind of know what happened here because the legal advice has now been published by the Toronto Star. Basically, the city concedes, it seems, in their legal advice that the Star published, that this violates the right to freedom of expression. I mean, we already knew this. This is a ban on protests within a certain area. The area in Toronto is smaller than the area in Calgary. In Toronto, it was originally going to be 20 meters, now 50 meters. Now it's for a 1-year period when you apply. It doesn't apply everywhere. And the reason Toronto put in these different sort of conditions, so the 1 year, the smaller area, the requirement for application, is because in Canada, under our Constitution, if the government is going to violate a constitutionally protected right, they can violate it if that limit is demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. This is in Section 1 of the Charter. There's a test for when a limit is justified. And I think the part of it that Toronto seems to be focusing on is trying to tailor it to make it less impairing of our rights. So it's not everywhere. It's only for 1 year. It's only 50 meters, not 100 meters. You need to apply. So they're trying to make it less broad. Now, we know from the reporting by the Star that the original proposal was supposed to be more tailored. The city ended up voting on amendments to broaden it to 50 meters to a year instead of 6 months or whatever it was. But I still think that this bylaw in the original form was still going to be an unjustified limit on the right to protest. I still think that this will capture all kinds of speech that is valid, important, constitutionally protected speech. You have a right to protest in Canada. The right to protest exists for people and causes who are otherwise not close to power. They don't have other ways of accessing the levers of power to influence government. And speaking up and marching in the streets is a way for groups who don't control government to influence government or shift public opinion. And sometimes these causes are unpopular. To the extent that protests, as I said, blockade infrastructure, engage in harassment, intimidation, or violence, the criminal code and bylaw already exists. And to the extent it's not being enforced, this bylaw will not help. To the extent that we say, there's violence targeting the Jewish community, and there's no doubt about it. But someone who's intent on committing arson or shooting at a Jewish school, which our society should be appalled by. We should be appalled that this is happening. But if someone is intent on committing violence, the existence of this bylaw is not going to stop them. Those things that they're engaging in are already illegal.
I also think, in addition to what you've said, that, the examples that you give of the arson, the shooting up of a Jewish school, these are not protests, right? These are horrible things that are happening, but those
are criminal acts.
Right. They're not protests. And so the conflation of all of these things together has been a huge problem in this conversation for me. The example that many people have referenced that I've seen in Toronto and in other parts of the GTA who are passing bubble zone bylaws is abortion bubble zone laws, which are some of the original kinds of these laws. first passed, I believe, in British Columbia in the mid 90s to ensure access to abortion clinics. And a lot of the supporters of these other zones that we're talking about today have referenced the BC abortion law and in other provinces saying, well, you all didn't seem to have a problem when we were providing access for women to access abortion services. You're hypocrites because you have a problem with this. Do you see a marked difference between what the governments of different provinces have done on abortion access with bubble zones versus these other demonstration type laws for, whatever it be, COVID-19, the Calgary city municipal stuff? Is there a marked difference?
I actually don't think so. And I agree with that criticism. I think that I also object to the bubble zone laws around abortion clinics. Now, that said, I support the right of women to access abortion as a medical service. And I understand why those protests are very upsetting. But I do think once we get into policing the content of speech, we're in really dangerous and unconstitutional territory. So the abortion bubble zone laws have not been upheld by the Supreme Court. They have been upheld when they were challenged in British Columbia. I think it went to the Court of Appeal. I think that's as far as it went. The Ontario version, I think it was enacted in 2016.
I believe 2017.
Yeah, around it's more recent. It's actually more recent that other provinces created them. Now, for those interested in the history of why BC created a bubble zone law around abortion clinics, it was because at that time, the abortion providers, the physicians who provided abortion services, were actually the subject of violence, like real violence. One was shot. So there was a very different context of serious violence targeted specifically at this at this exact issue. So when that was upheld by the BC Court of Appeal, it was in a very different context from what we're seeing in Calgary, which is, there's no suggestion that there has been violence at the Calgary protests around the Reading with Royalty program or around the bathroom access policy by the city. Now, you could make a closer analogy to the pro-Palestinian protests if you want to draw a connection between the shooting at a Jewish girls' school in Toronto. People could draw that conclusion if they want to make the argument about justification. I don't actually agree with that. And I also think that even in that context, I do not think that the BC abortion law should have been upheld. I think we should use the criminal code to charge people who engage in crimes like shooting. I mean, these are terrible things. I think it should actually open our eyes to a really dangerous sentiment that exists in some of the protests. I think you and I probably do not agree on the pro-Palestinian protests. I think that there is a vein of anti-Semitism in some of them. And I think that even though the shooting that happened at the Jewish girls' school was not a part of the protest, I think that was the reason the shooting happened. Just as that's the reason the shooting happened where two people were murdered in Washington, D.C.
The reason being sentiment over Israel-Gaza?
I think that there's a sentiment of anti-Semitism as well. I think that there is a vein of anti-Semitism in that movement. Now, of course, not everyone who objects to the war, Israel's war against Hamas, is an anti-Semite. Would be an absurd claim, but there is a vein of anti-Semitism that I think is very concerning, very, very concerning. And I do understand why communities are asking for the laws that they're asking for. I think that the laws are unconstitutional. Just as I think there's a real, I have compassion for women who do not want to be subject to the images of aborted fetuses when they're going to get an abortion. I have a lot of sympathy for that. If you're a woman who needs an abortion, it's a very, very difficult experience. And I have sympathy that you don't want to be exposed to that. But in our society, we need to be tolerant of people who have views that are different from our own, even if those views upset us.
Hey, Christine, Mark Carney, the prime minister, ran on a pledge to bring in a federal bubble zone for the same reason as Toronto did, which is Jewish institutions. He has kind of offhandedly mentioned attacks on mosques as well, but that doesn't seem to be his chief concern. His concern seems to be Jewish institutions. He wants a bubble zone legislation federally, which could carry, again, criminal charges and a criminal record after a conviction. Um, where do you fear we're going as these kinds of proposals become more and more prevalent in this country?
I was very, very critical when I read that in the Liberal Party platform. I think it's a really dangerous proposal to further criminalize and surveil protest movements. As I said, protest is the way that communities that don't have power express their views to those who do have power. And I think that this proposal by Mark Carney will result in increased surveillance of protest movements. It will result in the criminalization of people who object to government policy. We saw what happened with the 2022 convoy in Ottawa, where bank accounts were frozen. That protest was, for whatever people's views are on that protest, it was notable for its lack of violence. It was a long and loud protest, but protests by their nature are loud. Protests by their nature are disruptive. And once the federal government gets involved in policing protests with a much heavier hand than and much more robust powers than municipalities have, we're in really dangerous territory. The government should not be picking and choosing what we are allowed to protest, because, as I said, once they do, we have really eroded and hollowed out that right itself, and it loses all meaning entirely. The whole idea of protesting is that you are protesting something the government is doing. Generally, if the government decides you can't protest the government, there's no right there anymore.
Christine, thank you so much for your time and your insights today.
Thank you.
That was my conversation with Christine Van Geyn, a liar with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Let's now turn our attention to Toronto, where the local city council has just passed its own bubble zone bylaw. This bylaw allows for a perimeter of 50 meters to be established outside of a designated place of worship, school, or childcare center, and it controls what demonstrators can do and say within that 50-meter perimeter, if they're able to enter it at all. Toronto City Council contemplated this bylaw for months, saying that it needed to do something to respond to local Palestine solidarity demonstrations, which it claimed were threatening the safety of the Jewish community. My next guest is Dalia Awwad, a local Palestinian organizer and a member of a committee that has been set up to support more than 100 people who have been criminalized for their participation in Palestine solidarity demonstrations. And just for full disclosure to our audience, I am one of the over 100 people in the city of Toronto who in the last 19 months has been charged for my participation, criminally charged for my participation in a demonstration. My charges are still outstanding and have not been tested in the courts. Here's my conversation with Dalia. Dalia, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me today.
My pleasure. Let me just first ask you for your general thoughts about this new law and what it's going to mean.
Ultimately, I feel like this bylaw is an extension of what we've seen the state trying to do over a number of years, which is claw back at people's charter protected rights. And I don't think we've seen this only begin in the last 19 months of the Palestine movement, in the sense of, with the current escalation in Gaza, we've seen quite an increase in the number of demonstrations taking places in cities. But I think this is something that has been worked at since COVID. There's been different reasons for it. And I think ultimately it's working to increase the police's ability to criminalize folks who are expressing dissent against the status quo. I think it will also impact unions. It will impact, anyone who is marginalized will become even further marginalized by this law. And ultimately, it's an extension of the police increasing the power that they have in this city. Toronto Police Service has an astronomical budget. My prediction is that the police will be front and center in enforcing this bylaw, and it won't just be bylaw officers, which the city has outlined will be the case, is that the police can help bylaw officers, but I imagine that it'll essentially end up being the Toronto Police who are trying to use their budget to move that forward.
Now, you rightly point out that this law applies to more than just the Palestine solidarity demonstrations that we've been seeing in the last 19 months, and it will be used for more than that. However, it was very clear during this bylaw's development and during the vote at council that concern about and fear of Palestine solidarity demonstrations has been the driving force of this new legislation. So I want to get your thoughts specifically on the idea that this is one of the ways that the city of Toronto has decided to respond to a mostly peaceful demonstration movement for Palestine.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that come to mind with that. I think the first is I think the Toronto Police has not needed the bylaw to criminalize the Palestine Solidarity Movement in the Toronto area. To date, we have more than 116 arrests that have taken place, and this is before the bylaw has even gone into effect. And we've seen, Toronto Police at different city council meetings stating that, we're already kind of enforcing different versions of this bubble zone bylaw in practice. And what that means is there's quite a bit of, strategic incapacitation that Toronto Police already does, and there's a lot of dictating what routes protests can take, and it's often always arbitrary, but 1 week you can't go south on University, another week you can't go on College, and they dictate what happens. And if the crowd pushes back, then the police will either brutalize people and or arrest people as a result. And so we've already seen that happening. I think another thing we've seen is that the Toronto Police have used, seemingly like innocuous pieces of enforcement around the truck that's being used with the sound system. And what that means is that they've come into the crowd saying nobody can be standing at the foot of the truck, the bed of the truck, and speaking while the truck moves. And that's something that in the city of Toronto has been for a decade, at least to my knowledge, has had people standing at the back of a truck at demonstrations and parades and what have you. And now that's no longer possible. And the reason they're doing that isn't because they're just being annoying. It's so they can surveil the crowd, figure out who organizers are, what the discipline looks like, and be able to gather intel that way. Up until now, we've also seen the Toronto Police really build up this narrative that they need an inflated budget so they're able to surveil these protests, and this idea that the Palestine Solidarity Movement is of mainly foreigners bringing their violent ways of protesting, and I'm air quoting here, I realize it's a podcast, their violent ways of protesting from the Middle East, and when in reality, the people who've been violent have been the Toronto Police. And so I think this bylaw they've been building to it for the last 19 months. And I think one of the things that's really unfortunately helpful in pushing forward this bylaw is the fact that Zionism has attached itself to a religious faith. And so there's a big conflation between a political ideology and a religion. And then that becomes all meshed into one. So a critique of a state, the state of Israel's action becomes equal to anti-Semitism. And then there's this idea that if you say Israel is committing a genocide, which in fact Israel is committing a genocide, but according to, Mayor Chow, according to a bunch of city councilors, that in itself is anti-Semitic, and we need the hate crimes unit on it. And so I think what they've been trying to build is this idea of good protests versus bad protests. And this idea of where do you protest has been a common thread that we've seen if we go back to different news coverages of things. I think we can't, forego talking about the role the media has played in all of this, because we've seen this for a long time. So in January 2024, there were the protests that took place at Avenue Road Highway 401. And then the narrative that spun out of that is like, oh, these like pro-Palestine solidarity protests are popping up in this mostly Jewish neighborhood, and they're targeting the Jewish community here, when in reality, the people protesting are people who are from the community. It's people coming out in their own neighborhood. And then we saw that again in I believe it was February 2024, where we had, like a emergency rally that went on for over 3 hours, marched south on University Avenue, and it passed by Mount Sinai Hospital. And immediately the narrative spread like wildfire that this action was intended to target Mount Sinai for anti-Semitic reasons, which the protest paused there for maybe 10 minutes max. In March 2024, there was the illegal sale of stolen lands in the West Bank that took place at a synagogue, and folks protested that because under international law, that is in fact illegal. And that ended up being presented as, oh, you're targeting a synagogue. And I think there's also a question of, I think across the city, religious institutions, churches, synagogues, mosques are used for political events as well. And so if we're saying that people can't have a response to it, then we're saying that if a religious institution is having, let's say if a church is having an event where they're saying, yeah, we should bring back residential schools, then we can't protest it because it's happening at a church. Where do we land? And unfortunately, there is a lengthy history in settler colonial states of using religious institutions as a means to achieve political objectives. And we've seen that with residential schools here in so-called Canada. You see that with, the mixing of the political ideology of Zionism with the Jewish faith, and so on and so on. So I think there's something that's being built to, but it's being built to with the bylaw was being built to for a while. And it's with the intention of making it so the focus is how are people protesting, where are they protesting, and not what are they protesting, and what is the state's response to it. Is obfuscating what's going on and obfuscating what, the masses of people in this country are objecting to, which is a role the state has in genocide.
As a quick follow-up, you mentioned Mayor Chow, who did vote in support of the ultimate proposals for the bubble bylaw, but did not speak at all during the entire debate. Didn't ask a question, didn't make any public statements, didn't talk to the media afterwards. And I just wonder quickly what your thoughts are of the person leading the city who's made a lot of accusations against the protest movement for Palestine, choosing not to say anything upon the passage of this very important law.
I mean, I think we've seen that Mayor Chow presents herself as a progressive when in reality she is anything but that. She has tweeted on various occasions racist statements about the Palestine solidarity demonstrations that have taken place in the city. There were protests that were taking place at the Eaton Center, and Mayor Chow was talking about how that's illegal, when in reality, the right to protest in those in malls was something that her former husband fought for. So I think there's quite a bit of disconnect between the legacy of who Chow wants to be seen as and who she is in reality. And I think she is somebody who has allowed an inflated TPS budget to continue while the rest of the city's infrastructure is slowly crumbling. I think she has the interest of maintaining her seat in mind, and I don't think that interest is aligned with what most people in the city need.
You mentioned how much criminalization of pro-Palestine protests there's already been in the city of Toronto over the last year and a half without a law like the one that just passed. And you're a member of the Legal Support Committee, which has been supporting a lot of people who have been arrested. I want everybody to know in full disclosure that I am one of the over 100 people who have been arrested for attending a pro-Palestine demonstration. And so you and I actually have interacted through that support that you're doing. Can you talk more about the impact that criminalization has had on people who've come out to these demonstrations, who've been saying no to the siege on Gaza, no to occupation, and have been arrested, have been criminally charged. What's the impact that you see of the over 100 people that this has happened to already in Toronto?
It's difficult to articulate. Every aspect of their life is impacted by this. For starters, we've had 11 home raids for folks, which ends up meaning that people for lengthy periods of time feel utterly unsafe in their own home. And there's folks who've had physical injuries as a result of their arrest, where TPS brutalized them in the process of their arrest, and that recovery has been long term. There has been a concerted effort by TPS to put out a media release for almost every arrest that has taken place related to Palestine, which then the media runs with and regurgitates as though it's fact. And that ends up impacting people's lives because your name is out there when you're alleged to have committed a crime and there's no follow up when those charges are resolved or to provide more details. I think, a high percentage of the time that results in people being doxxed online, which means there's a campaign of people who are like sending death threats, all types of atrocious threats to people's social media. Sometimes people's phone numbers are released online. We've had situations where people's home addresses are released online as well, and it ends up being this like public punishment for something you have not even been found guilty of. And also, for context, we've had 55 charges that have been resolved, and we've had no convictions to date. And so just to say that, like, of those 100 people, more than half or almost half have not had convictions, and the rest are on their way to having those charges resolved in various ways. And we'll see what that ends up looking like, and hopefully, again, the no convictions continues. But just to say that also, like, when TPS convicts, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have enough evidence to show that somebody is guilty. That's ultimately a decision that the Crown and the judge decides, or the courts decide. There's also been obviously material impacts that folks have felt because as a result, again, going back to that doxing, sometimes people's employers are contacted, or their employers see what's happening online and they let them go. And when you're let go, your employment becomes more precarious as you have all this negative media about you. And again, you haven't been found guilty of a crime. We've also had people who've lost their housing. So the negative impacts of this and have been, varied. And the intention is that the process is the punishment. Some people's charges have dragged on for longer than a year, and only for them to be to have them withdrawn. And with judges saying, I'm surprised this wasn't withdrawn earlier because you actually have no basis for what you're doing right now. And when you have charges laying over your head for over a year, that is quite a bit of anxiety and depression and different mental health impacts that this has on you. And and the process is intended to isolate people and individualize make it so it's like your problem. You're the one who's been arrested, so this is for you to deal with on your own, and you're on your own doing it. And maybe the last thing I'll mention on this, because I could probably go on for an hour about this, and I shouldn't, but is another piece that's been has had great impact is the conditions that have been put on people for bails. One really common condition is non-association, which means if you have someone who is a co-accused for the same alleged offense, you're not allowed to communicate with each other. And for people who organize together, that can end up being really difficult. There have been conditions that have gone so far as to say you can't go in within 500 meters of a certain location. And for context, when it's a domestic abuse case, the parameter for that is 250 meters. So just to show the discrepancy between the two. And then we've had people who've had protest bans put on them. We've had things go as far as no internet use. We've had conditions really that infringe on people's charter protected rights. And I think also, the intended purpose is for the process to take for a real long time, and for the movement to shift its focus and put all its energy towards dealing with these charges and fighting them. And so people are no longer able to protest or mobilize or organize or do all the things that they were doing or wanting to do.
Well, my final question has to do with the aftermath now of this law being passed in Toronto. We've seen in other places around the GTA, Oakville, Vaughan, it's been passed in similar ways. Hamilton, Ottawa, still contemplating similar bubble zone laws. Mark Carney at the federal level, our prime minister, is saying he's going to bring in laws federally that will carry criminal penalties. And yet, we've also seen a lot of resistance. We've seen civil liberties organizations like the Canadian Constitution Foundation and the Canadian Civil Liberties Association saying that they're going to challenge this law in court. We've seen CUPE 79, the local union that includes the bylaw enforcement officers that you were mentioning earlier. They have said that this violates their rights and they want to challenge this law. And that's despite the fact that the city put in a last minute carve out saying that this doesn't apply to unions. So unions still have their rights to protest in ways that other people don't. But still, all kinds of, civil society groups are mobilizing. The consultation at Toronto City Hall was just flooded with people saying, this is a bad idea. We don't need this. We've already got existing laws and this is against free expression. So what do you think is the best way for people to continue pushing back now that this law has passed and now that it will come into force in July and will kind of be in a somewhat new reality of people thinking how to demonstrate?
This bylaw isn't coming out of thin air. It's something the state has been building towards, which makes perfect sense for a settler colonial state where certain people's existence is already criminalized. Indigenous folks, unhoused folks, marginalized folks, Black folks, their existence is criminalized by the state already. And so it brings into question, what is our relationship to the quote unquote legal system? What is our relationship to the state, and what laws do we abide by? Particularly when they're fascist laws, because the state is clearly intending on wanting, like their desire is for these protests to become these public spectacles that, organizers can congratulate themselves on this protest on their Instagram pages or what have you, and then pack it up and go home and not have put any real pressure on the state. And so I think ultimately, it's our responsibility to make sure that the streets remain ours. And by ours, I mean the streets remain those of the masses, and not what the city tells you you're allowed to do. And I don't mean that in a, ultimately, protest is meant to put pressure and disrupt what is going on. It's supposed to disrupt business as usual. And so if we are attending protests that are fitting very well into the box of business as usual, then what are we doing? And if the intention is to put enough pressure on the state to make them, move forward on the demands that most people are making of them, then that means challenging that bylaw and making it clear that regardless of if you sign this into effect, this isn't what dictates what happens in our streets.
Dalia, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. That's our show for today. Just a note that if you want to learn a little bit more about bubble zones and their history across Canada, I've written a recent piece that's in The Breach, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes so you can feel free to check it out. If you like what you've heard on The Breach show today, please subscribe to the podcast. And if you want to support our work, please become a sustaining member to help us produce more journalism for transformation. And you can do that by going to breachmedia.ca/support. Thanks for listening.